So studies relating to the Home Guard, most notably by the likes of S.P. Mackenzie and Ian Beckett, have tended to concentrate almost entirely on Great Britain, and even when the Ulster Home Guard is discussed, it is often misunderstood. Owing to the fact that the Ulster Home Guard was established as part of the Ulster Special Constabulary in late May 1940, some histories of that force, by those such as Sir Arthur Hessler, have also included some detail relating to this wartime episode in the force's history. However, the only detailed study of the force related to the force, has been undertaken by David Orr in his richly illustrated work Duty Without Glory, which chronicles the force from its birth until the Red Scares of the mid-1950s. Although this is an incredibly useful and insightful study of the Ulster Home Guard, based largely on newspaper sources, a large part of it is devoted to its operational role, as well as its equipment and training. Therefore, it fails to address many of the political and societal issues surrounding the force in any great detail. And this is what this paper today, if I can get my words out, will concentrate on today. So ultimately, what will be argued is that firstly, the Ulster Home Guard was shrouded in political difficulties from its inception, owing in no small part to the fact that it was raised as part of the B Specials. Secondly, owing to the view that the B Specials, and by extension the Ulster Home Guard, was majority Protestant, there was very little Catholic representation. In fact, only 150 Catholics were enlisted in the force throughout the entirety of the war. This number has been found after the British government asked the Northern Irish government to draw up numbers for Catholic participation. Despite this rather low figure, the lack of Catholic men in the force appears to have been more to do with apathy rather than any outright hostility towards it. Within Protestant society, however, participation was significant. As much as 10% of the Protestant male population was serving in the Ulster Home Guard by 1942, an even higher participation rate than in other areas of the United Kingdom. This indicates clearly that the Ulster Home Guard are at least representative of Protestant society in Northern Ireland, and demonstrates a continuation of what has been labelled by D.W. Miller as the Protestant volunteering tradition, which had manifested itself as early as the 17th century and had continued through organisations such as the militia, yeomanry and also volunteer force throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. So initially, when the Home Guard was raised in Great Britain in May 1940, the formation was not originally extended to Northern Ireland, and as the official history of the war indicates, the country was, quote, disappointed not to be permitted an equal opportunity of war service, meaning that Prime Minister Lord Craigavon, himself a former officer in the militia and yeomanry, pressed for the inclusion of the provision of the province within the scheme. However, difficulties with regard to this did exist. Most notably, local defence volunteers in Great Britain had been formed using the existing territorial associations around the country, but in Northern Ireland this association was far too small to be able to handle the task, as it only operated in County Antrim. As a result, in Cabinet as early as the 20th of May, Craigavon outlined the possibility of informing the press that a similar scheme could be extended to Ulster by creating a new section within the B Specials. So, on the 25th of May, Craigavon announced that a corps of defence volunteers would be formed without delay, and that the B Specials would form the nucleus for this new force. Concurrently, independent home defence formations based largely around old comrades associations have begun to spring up across Northern Ireland, such as that based around those who had served in the 14th Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles. These would be absorbed into the newly created Ulster Defence Volunteers section of the Special Constabulary, announced in Stormont on the 28th of May. The main Royal Ulster Constabulary and Ulster Special Constabulary were detailed to undertake home defence duties, but this new section was to be formed confined only to home defence and not as an aid to the civil power. It was to be recruited on a county basis in accordance to the military authorities' assessment of requirements and consist of, quote, carefully selected Ulstermen. Importantly, from the outset, it was maintained that in the event of invasion, all members of the force would come under the command of the military, meaning that at that point they would be classed as military combatants and not civilian police. A very important distinction should they come into enemy contact. So the first summer of its existence went by with little problem as the force began to bed into its home defence duties. some of which we will see after I've spoken here in the Story of the Ulster Home Guard film. This map here, which I'll talk a little bit about later on indirectly at least, shows some of the distribution of the force. This is a document available here in PRONI, in fact, so it's very interesting, I think, in terms of that distribution, which, as I say, I'll speak about in a little while. So, although initially things had gone by without much of a hitch, the perceived problems with the arrangement between the Ulster Special Constabulary and Ulster Home Guard publicly came to a head in September 1940, when a letter was sent to Churchill, as well as other prominent political leaders, signed by 22 influential Anglo-Irish figures, including many Unionists, headed by Sir Hubert Gough. This letter denounced the discriminatory nature of the Ulster Home Guard because of its affiliation with the Ulster Special Constabulary. In response to this, the Northern Ireland government were very definite about its position on the matter, stating that the reasons for the raising of the force using the Ulster Special Constabulary as its nucleus was the most satisfactory solution available in such a very sort of short space of time as it was in May 1940, and that they were able to select, quote, a body of men of proved loyalty. Unfortunately, this had the effect of alienating almost an entire section of the population, something which was of secondary importance when the risk of invasion was so high. The issues surrounding the Ulster Home Guard being formed as part of the Police Specials did not only concern the problems of possible sectarianism, but also included the issue over its civilian or military control, although these debates were related. This debate continued for much of the first half of the war. Robert Fisk has argued, having interviewed J.C. McDermott, the Minister for Public Security, that doubts had been raised in late 1940 over the constitutional position of the Ulster Home Guard. McDermott believed that the Northern Ireland government had no power to raise such a force under the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 in the first place, but that in May 1940 nobody minded because of the immediate emergency. In the early days of 1941, discussions in Westminster began to occur with regard to this issue. These reiterated the memorial letter of the previous September. Herbert Morrison, the British Home Secretary, felt the responsibility of the volunteers being in the hands of the Northern Ireland government could be justified as a necessary measure for raising the force in an emergency. However, he did not see it possible to keep it as a lasting arrangement. This was for two reasons. Firstly, that constitutionally the Northern Ireland government could only be responsible for internal law and order and not defence. And secondly, that loyal Catholics were unwilling to join a force which they saw as administered by a majority Protestant government. In reply to this, however, David Margeson, the newly appointed Secretary of State for War, outlined the Army's position with regard to this, stating that, quote, on the grounds of both military efficiency and the absolute necessity of not involving the Army in the religious animosities of Ireland, we should not offer to take over this force, and I am not at all disposed to make any withdrawal from this position of principle, unquote. It was this second reason that became the biggest sticking point for any transfer of authority, the overwhelming opinion being that the Army should avoid any controversies which might arise from such a transfer. Sir John Anderson, the Lord President, justified such a decision by outlining that at the time the Ulster Home Guard were not being used for defence purposes under the control of the Northern Ireland government, and in fact were only training and equipping itself for such a task in the event of an invasion. The outcome to this situation was perhaps best summed up by Churchill, who noted that, given that this issue was not in the public eye, there was no need to make it so, and that, in his view, it was better, quote, to let sleeping dogs lie. McDermott remained unhappy about this arrangement, but it was not to change, and it's been argued that this situation meant that the Imperial government had pressed the Northern Ireland government into maintaining an unconstitutional arrangement, which had the result of strengthening the recruiting problems of the force. This is largely true, but of course the Northern Ireland government had not done itself any favours in the way that it had acted when the force had first come into being. It was not until August 1941 that any concrete decision was made with regard to the status of the force. The British government drafted a defence regulation which officially denied the existence of the Ulster Home Guard except as special constabulary members, but that outlined that they would come up officially under military control should an emergency arise. As a result of this, members of the force were required to undertake a new declaration which stated their liability to fall under military control in the event of the invasion and so also be subject to military law. This liability was also outlined that they were only required to serve within Northern Ireland. These points were undoubtedly crucial to the future organisation of the force and went some way in satisfying the various parties concerned. This does not mean, however, that these problems went away. The British Attorney General, Donald Somerville, for example, still called for the importance of maintaining a clear distinction between the police and the armed forces, so it would be much easier should an emergency occur. Even within the Ulster Home Guard itself, by compiling notes with relation to the history of the force, it was stated that any stressing of the B Special connection should be avoided. It appeared, though, that this was the most satisfactory settlement that was ever to occur. Clearly then the Ulster Home Guard was shrouded with political difficulties right from its outset, and it was these difficulties that had an effect on its social composition and its place within Northern Irish society. So as has already been established, the Ulster Home Guard was made up almost entirely of Protestant men from across Northern Ireland, both in its officer corps and its rank and file, and a number of interesting observations might be made with regard to this. By January 1942, an estimated 1,349 officers were serving in the 29 battalions of the Ulster Home Guard. Amongst them, Sir Henry Mulholland, the MP for Down and Speaker of the Northern Ireland House of Commons, was the Lieutenant Colonel of the 5th Belfast Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur O'Neill Chichester of the 2nd Antrim Battalion, who apart from being an honorary colonel of the Territorial Army in Northern Ireland after the war, was appointed the Clerk of the Parliaments of Northern Ireland from 1945 to 1948, and was also elected as the Mayor of Ballymena from 1948 to 1951. Furthermore, William Miller Cameron, a major in the same battalion, was also elected as a member of the Northern Ireland Senate as late as 1969. Importantly, though, this element only made up a very small proportion of the officer corps. In fact, a reliance on business leaders across Ulster for officers is clear to see. As examples, Major John Kerr of the 2nd Belfast Battalion was a partner in Kerr and Reid, a grocer situated in the Upper Newtonards Road in East Belfast. Also, Captain Robert Alexander Johnston of the 1st Down Battalion was the Managing Director of the Northern Ireland Tyre Service, having previously been a member of the Queen's University Officer Training Corps and as a C1 Special Constable. Of course, these examples of business interests within the force were supplemented by the existence of specific business detachments, such as William Ewart and Sons Limited, the Ormond Bakery, and of course the BBC attachment. Other than businessmen, the officer corps was also made up of a large proportion of current or former officers in the B Specials, or of ex-servicemen, mainly those who had served during the First World War. Many of these former servicemen were also decorated in their capacity as soldiers. Again, of the 1,349 officers listed in January 1942, it was recorded that at least 12 of them had been awarded Distinguished Service Orders, 26 were awarded Military Crosses, 7 the Military Medals, and 4 Distinguished Conduct Medals. Many of these men had furthermore served in the ranks, rather than as officers in the regular army. A demonstration that what was thought of those with previous experience was that was sort of the key. It wasn't so much about social standing, it was more to do with sort of their ability to train their men should an invasion occur. Previous military experience in any branch of the service, though, did not necessarily mean that a man would be instantly appointed as an officer or indeed as a ranker, especially if the man was a Catholic. Although many leading figures maintain that the Ulster Home Guard was not a sectarian force, and there is little evidence to suggest that those in high-ranking positions looked to stop Catholics from becoming officers, this did not mean that it did not occur at a local level. One such example was brought up in Stormont as early as July 1940, when it was stated that in a company in County Down, an ex-NCO of the Gordon Highlanders had presented himself for enrolment to the force, but despite not having any political connections, had been rejected on the grounds that he was a Catholic. The local commandant had stated that he, quote, would not take any papishes. Clearly then, the officer corps was not representative of Northern Irish society as a whole. However, the fact that those of business interests and previous military experience were accepted as officers meant that it was at least to a degree representative of Protestant society. The fact that many officers were shopkeepers, butchers, merchants, clerks, and even labourers supports this notion. Interestingly, because of the more democratic nature of the officer corps, the rank and file were not too dissimilar in this term. It is clear that Lord Glentoran, the Minister of Agriculture and a private in the Ulster Home Guard, was an exception to the rule when it came to this social background of the force. Although specific occupational breakdowns are not available for every company of the Ulster Home Guard, it's possible to make some considerations with the available data from surviving muster rolls, these mainly coming from the Antrim battalions, again available here at PRONI. For example, taking a company in a town such as Ballymena, an abundance of different occupations were recorded for the 189 men that there is data for. These occupations included, amongst others, 18 labourers, 20 clerks, 13 bankers, 6 merchants, 4 solicitors and 4 grocers. Similarly, for the Newton Arts Company of the Ulster Home Guard, of the 178 men there is occupational data for, there were listed 31 labourers, 5 mechanics, 12 clerks, 4 butchers and another 4 grocers. Amongst the other towns in Antrim, such as Antrim town itself, Larne in East Antrim and Lisbon, men with comparable occupations were listed. In the rural areas of County Antrim, as might be expected, the majority of the companies were made up of men who listed their occupation as farmer or farm labourer. When commenting on the Ulster Home Guard and its initial recruiting in 1940, it was stated that many men in business, in industry and in the farming community immediately joined the force. Furthermore, in a radio broadcast in February 1942, Major May commented that the Ulster Home Guard had obtained a large proportion of men from industries and from the land. Even in the official history of the War of Northern Ireland, it was claimed that the men came, quote, from the fields and the factories, from trade, industry and agriculture, government offices and linen houses, and from the hills and the valleys. Importantly, this occupational breakdown was also similar to that of the rest of Great Britain. The issue of Catholic participation in the force might also be discussed further here, especially the essential apathy towards it. Even as early as the 29th of May 1940, the Irish News, a nationalist newspaper, had commented that the Ulster Home Guard, along the lines in which it had been raised, could not possess the confidence of the entire population. Only a few days later, the Labour Party in Belfast had declared that it did not approve of the force for similar reasons. By June 1940, it was stated in Stormont that owing to the fact that recruiting was conducted through the B Specials at a county level, open discrimination had occurred, with the result that a large section of the population felt that all those under the police force were politically motivated. These sorts of accusations continued into 1941 after ongoing use of euphemisms by unionist politicians relating to the fact that, quote, loyal and trusted men had been selected to join the force. Clearly it is for these reasons why only the estimated 150 Catholic men had actually joined the force. There is no evidence to suggest any outright hostility towards it by Catholics, only indifference. Despite this, at its peak in November 1940, the strength of the Ulster Home Guard, including B Specials, whose strength was about 13,000 at the outbreak of the war, was 39,388 men. This number went into steady decline throughout 1941 until in January 1942 there were a total of 36,020 men in the force. The main reasons for this decline were that throughout the latter half of 1941, battalions had conducted a systematic process of eliminating men who had not been attending training. Furthermore, a number of units had been disbanded or absorbed into other units, and this resulted in a number of resignations. Although there are constant fluctuations regarding the numbers of men in the Ulster Home Guard, it is certain that its strength never reached its establishment, despite the successes of recruiting campaigns throughout the war. An absence of conscription into the force, as seen in Great Britain, meant that a continued decline occurred after it reached its peak until its disbandment in 1944. And this table sort of illustrates the strength breakdown by county, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So as has already been established, the number of Catholic men in the Ulster Home Guard was almost negligible, which is why an analysis of both the percentage of the total male population and the percentage of the Protestant male population has been carried out. From this analysis, it's certain that a disparity existed between the numbers of men who joined the force in each county. Perhaps understandably, the three mainly rural counties with the lowest population had the highest percentages of men enlisted. This was because the numbers required for these counties was higher and even more important than of other counties. They were effectively the three most at-risk border counties, both because they were in closer proximity to ERA and also because they were the more rural areas and so more susceptible to an airborne invasion. Furthermore, particularly in the case of County Fermanagh, the guarding of specific strategic targets such as aerodromes was required, and so there was a requirement for more men accounting, and that's sort of accounting a very high percentage that you can see on that table. With the absence of conscription, some of these statistics are rather impressive and fall in line with those of the rest of Great Britain. Looking at the strength of the Home Guard of Great Britain before conscription was introduced, the similar percentages were present in some of the Northern Irish counties for the male population as a whole. However, if only Protestant male population is taken, the Northern Irish contribution is much more significant than in other areas of the United Kingdom. Of course, there are problems with analysing only one section of the population, but it's clear that, at least from a Protestant point of view, that the contribution to the war effort was much higher than has perhaps previously been appreciated. Naturally, with the introduction of conscription in Great Britain, the numbers in that force dramatically increased when the numbers in Northern Ireland began to decline. Nevertheless, the sustained voluntary participation was still significant. Linked to the issue of men of military age joining the regular armies, as well as that of a lack of conscription within Northern Ireland, is that of the age demographic of the Ulster Home Guard. It's been noted that gradually, especially after the introduction of conscription in Great Britain, the Home Guard in that area became younger in its composition, whilst also including fewer men with previous military experience. Again, despite a lack of conscription in the country, the Ulster Home Guard followed a similar pattern. It is certainly true that large numbers of men were older than 35 when they joined the force when it was established in 1940, but throughout the war, many more men under this age were attracted, the oldest being an 80-year-old in near County Fermanagh. In the Ballymena Company, it was recorded that the average age of the men when they joined the force was 31 years of age. 2/3 of the company were below 35, and 1/3 of these were below 25. Even more strikingly, the Hillman Company, situated just west of Ballymena, was composed of 75% of its men under the age of 25. Additionally, the Newton Ards Company in County Down had an average age of only 25 for men who joined throughout the course of the war, and almost half of these were 20 years or younger, and many who had actually been even permitted to join the force at the age of 16. This younger demographic is an important observation, as it demonstrates the continued willingness of younger members of Northern Irish society to play their part in the defence of the area, and perhaps shows the degree of apathy towards the war was not as pronounced as was once thought. So by way of conclusion, a number of useful observations might be made regarding the political developments of the Ulster Home Guard and how these related to its position in Northern Irish society. The fact that the force was established as part of the B Specials created many problems. Most notably, it meant that a fairly insignificant number of Catholic men participated in the Ulster Home Guard. Additionally, the perception of its discriminatory nature did much to harm its image outside Northern Ireland, whilst the importance over the issue of whether it was under civilian or military control created further problems in this respect. Despite this, I think it's clear that necessity called for such an arrangement, having been built around an existing mechanism that was the B Specials, when the threat of invasion was so high during the summer of 1940. These political issues had repercussions on the force's position within society. Catholic apathy towards the Ulster Home Guard meant that it was almost entirely dominated by Protestant men from a broad cross-section of society. Participation by county varied significantly, and this was partly because the defence priorities were so varied, especially in rural areas. In comparison to Great Britain, the occupational breakdown was very similar. However, because there was no conscription to the force, it meant that it was no Dad's Army equivalent, and was in fact much younger in age demographic than its British counterpart. The fact that men participated in the Ulster Home Guard willingly, without conscription, had wider positive consequences, especially on its training, efficiency, and possible fighting abilities. Thank you very much.